If you look at the history of the American bison in the 19th century, you often find old pictures like this. Giant piles of bones everywhere. It made me wonder, where did all these bones come from and why are they piled up like that? We can find answers in books such as Buffalo Nation, Blood Memory, and Last Stand. In the 1870s, the hunting of the American bison escalated until the herds began to disappear completely from the American frontier. Fortunately, some of them found refuge in the newly formed Yellowstone National Park, and a few smaller private herds in Montana and Texas, though there were only a few hundred left by the late 1800s. In 1884, agents from Eastern manufacturing companies began to circulate in Montana railroad towns along the Yellowstone River. They were hunting buffalo 2 years after the last living animals had been wiped from the Montana plains. Though the buffalo was all but extinct, its gift to the American economy would continue in the form of a grimly final contribution: bones. There was money to be made in the bison's skeletons, and there were millions of them bleaching under the prairie sun. Millions more rested under the prairie sod from buffalo that had died long before the arrival of the hide hunters. Traveling west on the Canadian Pacific Railroad in 1888, author and journalist Julian Ralph wrote of the bone-filled plains and the big business that sprouted up to collect and sell the buffalo's remains. At the outset, we saw a few bison bones dotting the grass in white specks here and there, and soon we met great trains, each of many boxcars, laden with nothing but these weather-whitened relics. Presently we came to stations where, beside the tracks, mounds of these bones were heaped up from wagon loads gathered far from the railroads, for a great business had grown up in collecting these trophies. Go wherever we might, remembered Smithsonian taxidermist William Hornaday, on divides, into badlands, creek bottoms, or on the highest plateaus, we always found the inevitable and omnipresent grim and ghastly skeleton. Bone hunters simply tossed the bounty into wagons or carts, then hauled it to railheads to steamboat landings. In the early years of the trade in bones, it was not difficult to find them. For prairie homesteaders, clearing the ground of buffalo was often necessary before it was possible to plow, and farmers jokingly referred to bones as their first cash crop. Homesteaders in Nebraska and Kansas, desperate for cash because drought was withering their crops, turned to harvesting the skulls and skeletons littering the plains. One entrepreneur in Texas stacked mounds of bones along the tracks of the Fort Worth and Denver Railway and made $25,000. Buffalo bones, a Kansas newspaper reported, are now legal tender in Dodge City. The bison were killed once, but harvested twice, once by the hide hunters, once by the bone pickers. The bone business made money all along its route, from settlers who supported themselves collecting bones to the freighters who carried them. In the 1996 book Buffalo Nation, the caption for this old photograph reads, "Metis or mixed blood buffalo bone collectors stand amid mounds of bones bleached by the Canadian prairie sun." The bones were collected on the prairies in Red River carts such as the one pictured here. They were then loaded onto railroad cars and transported to factories in the East to be ground and used in refining sugar and for fertilizer. In its early days, Regina, Saskatchewan, served as a railhead where bones were deposited for freighting east. Before being tagged with its current, more refined name, Regina was known as Pile o' Bones for its industry. And I'm not being sarcastic when I say, stay proud of your name, Pile o' Bones Brewing Company. The skeletal remains of the once living herds had two primary industrial applications. Buffalo bones contained phosphate, which when ground and bagged could be sold as fertilizer. Bone black, another product of bone, was used as a filter in the processing of sugar. Companies in the East offered an average of $8 a ton for bones they could grind into fertilizer or use in refining sugar. Buffalo horns were turned into buttons, combs, and knife handles. Hooves became glue. A company in St. Louis processed more than 1 million tons of bones. The Michigan Carbon Works became Detroit's largest industry. Buffalo Nation also borrows a quote from the 1954 book, The Buffalo Hunters. One bone-buying firm estimated that over the 7 years, 1884 to 1891, they bought the bones of approximately 5,950,000 buffalo skeletons, and there were many firms in the business. By one estimate, bones generated more money than hides. A single St. Louis facility processed 1.25 million tons of bones, the remains of more than 12 million buffalo. Unfortunately, the bone hunting took one more turn for the worse. Along with the bones of buffalo, the bones of Indians could often be found on the plains, set up on their high burial scaffolds. The scaffold weakened over time, eventually spilling the contents onto the prairie floor. So it was that the bones of Indians, wedded to the buffalo in life, were gathered up and sold with those of the bison. And so the clearing of the American bison and Native Americans from the Great Plains continued on its own dark course, until there was little left to remove. In the end, the bone trade would generate more profits for the bone pickers, the railroads, and the industries than the buffalo hides ever had. Perhaps more telling as to the fate of the buffalo was how quickly the bone business died. By 1894, the bones too were gone, and there were no more herds to replace them. The St. Paul and Chicago Railroad freighted east 35,000 to 40,000 hides and 10,000 robes in 1882. In 1885, they shipped next to none. The American buffalo, having sustained the inhabitants of the Great Plains for millennia, had finally given all that it could. In the same year, officials of Yellowstone National Park placed the total population at 200, with 250 as the outside limit. Sadly, within 10 years, the numbers were much less than that. But recovery was on the way, thanks to the few remaining herds in Yellowstone, Montana, and Texas. Meanwhile, conservationist George Bird Grinnell, who wrote prolifically throughout his life, penned what is arguably his greatest essay while staring down at two relics of his past. In The Last of the Buffalo, an 1892 article for Scribner's Magazine, Grinnell recalled how he had gathered up the skulls from the prairie. On the floor, on either side of my fireplace, lie two buffalo skulls. They are white and weathered, the horns cracked and bleached by the snows and frosts and the rains and heats of many winters and summers. Often, late at night, when the house is quiet, I sit before the fire and muse and dream of the old days, and as I gaze at these relics of the past, they take life before my eyes. Thanks to people like him and many others, the dream of American bison herds grazing out on the Great Plains is no longer just a dream. Today we have the luxury of looking back on the near extinction of the American bison with regret, but also relief that they survived. And we can put the event in context with the people who also fought for their survival. So they took everything from us, and we understood that as a way of killing us off, said Gerard Baker, a Mandan Hidatsa Indian, whose ancestors had kindly helped Lewis and Clark through their incredibly cold and harsh first winter. They killed the spirit of the buffalo, in some cases, we thought, but that's why our prayers got stronger. They had to. If they didn't, we would have been killed off like the buffalo. Even though they kind of went away, we still had that connection, and that's what helped us survive as Indian people. Thank you for watching. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel for new videos every week or two, and see the description below for a list of books and online resources featured in this video.